Hey guys, welcome. Today I'm going to start a new series, okay? So this is going to be Wikiwand. Mains does Wikiwand. I don't know. That sounds super lame. I'll think of a cool title. But what we're going to do is look at some of the history of psychology. Okay. Anyways, maybe I'll chill with these annotation tools. But my idea here is that you guys have heard me defend Wikipedia forever. I think that this is an amazing collection of human knowledge. Wikiwand is just an app that presents it full screen like this. But I want to use this as a chance to talk about the history of psychology. I'm going to do a whole lecture series on this. All right. Today, psychology is defined as a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Philosophical interest in the human mind and behavior dates back to ancient civilizations. Right. So, in our psychology class, you often hear me talk about the beginning of psychology being linked to people like William James and Sigmund Freud. And that's true in terms of psychology as a field, but it's not as if no one had ever thought about the mind before those people. Okay, so while they have the rightful place and their place is coming, and what I mean by that is, if I click this, yeah, so we're going to start off with an introduction, then do an overview, then get into early psychological thought, then we're going to look at the beginning of modern psychology, all right, the Enlightenment, stuff like that. Then we're going to look at the emergence of what's called German experimental psychology. We're going to look at how guys like Immanuel Kant heavily influenced this, Wilhelm Wundt. All right, and then we're going to move towards William James and then eventually the psychoanalysts. All right, and that's the kind of where we started our courses with the Freuds and the Jungs and the Adlers and the Ericksons. Then we'll get into early American, early French, early British, early Russian psychology. All right, second generation German psychology, the emergence of American behavioralism and Skinner and all those guys. Second generation Francophone psychology. To be honest, without pre-looking at that, I'm not sure what that's going to be about. That's the first one. I'm not really sure. Soviet Marxist psychology. That's going to be very interesting and will include the work of guys like Pavlov, who obviously had his dogs, but who also was heavily involved with military efforts, as were most of these people. And then cognitivism, right, or kind of current brain research. Okay, so that's where we're going with this. And sorry, as I do a couple of these, my handle on the tech will get better. Okay, so I think this is an important thing to think about is that the philosophical interest in the human mind goes back deep, deep into some of our earliest civilizations. And I find it really interesting to think that like the civilizations listed there are all ones that mastered written language early. Right? Why do we know what the Egyptians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Chinese and the Indians thought of Indian as in India, the country, thought of the mind? Why don't we know what the Celts and the Gauls and the Kush and the Native Americans thought? Well, we do some in the Native American part. I am going to pull in some stuff at one point. Where's this book? I have the book called Native Myth and Legends um, from the Northern Pacific of America. So basically from the West. And I'm going to incorporate that too. Okay, but today's just our intro. So what I'm going to be looking at, and if you're like, so what, you're going to basically read a Wikipedia page? Yeah, that's the plan. But what I'm going to do is add all kinds of rants throughout. All right, what this is basically doing is it's just a rant platform. Could have said that better if this was the podcast. A rant platform. Okay, so we're going to be looking. Let's just keep looking through this page for a sec. Let me use one of these annotation tools. Um, we'll highlight here. So here we're going to be looking at this. Okay, well, whatever. That tool didn't do what I thought it would do. But you guys hang in there. I'll figure that out. So, anyways, we're going to look at some of these basic types of psychology. We're going to look at abnormal psych, behavioral genetics, biological cognitive cognitivism, or basically just cognitive. Whenever you hear the word cognitive, it's talking about the actual work your brain does: decision making, memory, problem solving, grasping concepts, classifications, all the kind of mental work you do. Comparative psychology, so looking, again, that's in cross-cultural, cultural. That's interesting. That's not on the top of my list, but we'll touch on that. Differential, developmental psychology, obviously. Evolutionary psychology, obviously. Experimental, mathematical psychology should be interesting. I'm not really sure what that's going to be. Actually, that's probably the Germans. That's probably Wilhelm Wundt, which is a guy that really tried to, it's pre-Freud, really trying to kind of make the idea of it being a science, a math of the mind. Neuropsychology, or actually, now we're getting into more current stuff, personality research, positive psychology, which if you watched the social issues forum presentation, I was talking about positive psychology. And then quantitative, that just means basically stats. Okay, and then just stay on the right here for a sec. I'll come back to this overview on the left, but let's just stay in these hyperlinks for a sec, because I want to just give you the overview. I'm also going to be getting into applied psychology, so how applied behavioral, I'll just read this, applied behavioral analysis, clinical settings. I have a podcast coming soon with my brother, who we're just figuring out the details. It's going to be around anxiety. He's a clinical psychologist. If you guys have questions you want me to ask in that interview, we're going to be in general focusing on how to deal with the anxiety provocation that, or let me say that different, how to deal with the craziness of this current situation. Okay, so that's clinical, community psychology, consumer psychology, and advertising, counseling, critical psychology, educational, environmental. So those are just all different types: ergonomic, forensic, health, humanistic, industrial, legal, medical, military, psychology. Definitely be spending time on that. Music, how psychology affects things like brainwaves, occupation, how it affects work, obviously, politics, religion, school, sports psychology. I'll spend time on traffic psychology. We'll see what that means. But then again, I was almost going to laugh at that, but then we're worse sometimes when we're in our cars. You might be a super nice person that might give someone the finger when you're driving. You would never say that to someone, but you might do it when you're driving. Right? So traffic psychology might actually be interesting if I'm interpreting that right. All right, and then in terms of lists, I don't know why they have it. I guess this is just all their hyperlinks, but we're going to look at these things. This is kind of a cool overview. We're going to be looking at the different disciplines, the different organizations, different actual psychologists, different psychotherapies, different publications. Okay, research methods, theories, timelines, topics. Okay, enough of the chit chat. Let's start doing a bit of an overview. Psychology borders on various other fields, including physiology, that's the study of the physical body; neuroscience, the study of the science of your brain; artificial intelligence, right, which you've heard me argue should probably be called something like synthetic intelligence. It's artificial in the sense that it's created, but it's artificial sort of implies fake, and it's definitely not fake. Sociology, the study of groups; anthropology, the study of cultures, as well as philosophy and other components of the humanities. The history of psychology as a scholarly study of the mind and behavior dates back to the ancient Greeks. There's also evidence of psychological thought in ancient Egypt. Very high levels of work on mind sciences one can find in the Vedic scriptures of Santana Dharma, which is from Hinduism. I'm going to try my best on these names. The Hindu words aren't even the hardest. Once we get to some of these old German words, I'm just going to do my best and keep going. I'm not going to try to worry too much about that. So the Santa Tana Dharma from Hinduism is this part of the, looks like it's part of the Vedic scriptures, which is I don't know if they'd find it offensive saying that it's their Bible, but it's like that. It's their sacred book, I should say. Okay, one of them. So psychology was a branch of the domain of philosophy until the 1870s. So think about that for a sec. So that's relatively recent. I know it seems like forever ago, but when you're comparing it to a field like, say, mathematics, that's thousands and thousands of years old, being like a little over 100 years, being basically 150 years old, isn't that old for psychology? All right, and this is when we start to see some names you'll recognize. So it was a branch of philosophy until the 80s, I mean, to the 1870s, when it developed as an independent scientific discipline in Germany. Psychology as a self conscious field of experimental study began in 1879. So, what that means is like psychology is a field of study where people actually thought of it as psychology and not as just things that we can look back on and be like, oh, those people that were talking about religion and mind and spirit, those that was kind of psychological, or those people that Plato definitely talked about stuff that you could be like, oh, that sounds psychological. Okay, but as a self-conscious field, meaning like as a field that, as people that thought they of themselves as psychologists, we're getting close to 1900. We're getting close to Freud. Okay, Wilhelm Wundt, who I mentioned earlier, he founded the first laboratory dedicated exclusively to psychological research in Germany. He was the first person to refer to himself as a psychologist. Okay. Um, I'm not going to honor that Fernand part. I'm going to skip certain parts. Okay. Just because it's basically saying there's this other guy that says that he takes claim to it. I've never heard of that name. I have most certainly heard of Willem Wundt. Maybe I need to look into Ferdinand Oberweiser, who died in 1812, designated himself professor of empirical psychology and logic in 1783. Huh. I was going to breeze over that guy. Maybe I need to do a whole thing on him. Other important early contributors to the field include Hermann Ebbinghaus. Oh, yeah, a pioneer in the study of memory, right? So some people weren't necessarily psychologists how you think of it. They're not all Freud doing therapy. Some of them are psychologists because they're actually like kind of what we would think of as scientists, but just what they were focusing on was psychology related, like how people remember stuff. We would now consider anything that's related to memory. Excuse me, guys, as I have a little bit of a stomach upset today. But anyways, that it's a little bit of a memory thing. Okay, William James, giant man. Not literally, but William James wrote maybe the most important book ever written in some respects, called The Varieties of Religious Experience. I would definitely recommend it. And what he was trying to do, it might be the best book ever written on trying to bridge the gap between religion and psychology. And he does that as an elite philosopher, an elite psychologist, but also as someone who respects religion. And I think that's what's lacking in a lot of attempts to bridge those two gaps. You either have, religious people trying to talk psychological, or psychological people trying to please religious people, or at least placate them. And William James was actually both. I should pull them down at some point, but I also have up here a couple books, a couple of his early books. And if you're starting your own kind of private library in your own house, Principles of Psychology by William James. There's 2 volumes. That's a good start. Okay, and then Pavlov. You've all heard of Pavlov, right? Pavlov's dogs, and that he is associated with classical conditioning. Okay, so we'll just go a few more minutes here. I'll just finish these next couple paragraphs, and then we'll call it. Sorry for the scrolling. I'm going to try to figure out a way to do this in a way that doesn't make people watching this seasick. Soon after the development of experimental psychology, various kinds of applied psychology appeared. Stanley G. Hall. So one thing I'm hoping is that if you're listening to this, especially if you're my student, past student from psych, I'm thinking that me reading this entire thing, and I'm going to break this up over tons of videos, I'm hoping it adds context. And I think that's what Wikipedia's strength is. Yeah, maybe if you're doing a really specific research paper, you're going to want to have actual article references and stuff. I think the laughing at Wikipedia was 10 years ago. Wikipedia now is solid. And it again, like I said, you're not going to find a better overview than this. Maybe you will somewhere, but this is fantastic. Yeah, anyways, have I said enough about that I like Wikipedia? What I was going to say there is Stanley H. Hall, you'll remember, or G. Stanley Hall, you'll remember his name from psychology, where I talked about he's the one that introduced to psychology this idea of norms. It's a norm that kids start to talk at a certain age, or start to walk at a certain age, or start to do this at a certain age, or this is what the norm is for this, and this is what's normal, the normal for this or for that or for that. Okay, so Stanley brought scientific pedigree to the United States from Germany in the early 80s, right? So what that means is he brought scientific pedigree, means he brought status. He was a well known scientist who's now talking about psychology. All of a sudden, it seems more credible. Before I made a list of all the things I want to do these kind of things on for you guys, my list currently stands at like 78 things. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to make 78 videos, but who knows? This isn't necessarily time sensitive. I'm doing a few of these as fun, but my main goal right now is to get all the stuff that's course relevant for you guys out. But eventually, there's going to come to a point where we're going to get to April 24th and be done the courses. And if you guys still want to maintain as an academy, if you guys still want to, make this a meaningful thing, if you guys want to keep watching, again, once I'm done this one, I have at least 78 other topics I want to do. And one of them is John Dewey. So that's why I was on that rant. John Dewey's educational theory of the 1890s was another example, right? Another example of this, it becoming more of a science. Also in the 1890s, Hugo Munzenberg began writing about the application of psychology to industry, law, and other fields. So how can our understanding of the brain affect, things like worker performance, things like the courtroom? Leitner Whitmer established the first psychological clinic in 1890. James McKean Cartel adapted Francis Galton's anthropometric method. Anthropometric. So metric would mean measurement. Anthropo. Anthro is like a study of culture. The po in the middle of that word's throwing me off. Anthropometric method to generate the first program of mental testing. Okay, so it's some kind of psychometric, some kind of mental testing. I don't know if I've ever seen that word, anthropometric. In Vienna, meanwhile, Freud starts to develop his independent approach to the study of the mind called psychoanalysis, which has been widely influential, to say the least. How much more do we got? Okay, not much. 2 more paragraphs, okay? Or 3 more paragraphs. The 20th century saw a reaction to Edward Titchener's critique of once empiricism. Okay, so in the 20th century, this Edward guy came along and was critiquing Wundt's idea that empiricism means like that everything that is valuable needs to be something that we can measure. Empiricism is focused on measurement. It's not a comprehensive definition, but this contributed to the formation of things like behavioralism, right? So you got guys like Watson and later guys like Skinner coming along and saying, well, I don't necessarily care what happened in your childhood. I want to understand your behavior now and how I can modify your behavior through things like punishment and reinforcement. Okay, this contributed to the formation of behavioralism by John B. Watson, which was popularized by B.F. Skinner. Behavioralism proposed emphasizing the study of overt behavior. Overt means just seeable. So if you could have a video in my basement right now, you'd see I'm like sitting cross-legged on a chair in front of a monitor talking into a mic. That's overt, because that can be qualified and easily measured. Early behavioralists considered the study of mind to be too vague for productive scientific study. However, Skinner and his colleagues did think studying as a form of uh, did study thinking as a form of covert behavior. So remember, overt means what you see, covert would mean what I'm thinking about. So yes, I'm sitting in this chair in a certain way, but the thoughts going through my head are related to how I'm behaving. So they were interested in thoughts, but only in how it shaped behavior. Publicly observable behavior. The final decades of the 20th century saw the rise of the cognitive sciences, right? So a classic example of that would be a guy like Piaget. An interdisciplinary approach to studying the human mind. Cognitive science again considers the mind as a subject for investigation using tools of evolutionary psychology, linguistics, computer science, philosophy, behavioralism, and neurobiology. This form of investigation has proposed that a wide understanding of the human mind is possible and that such understanding may be applied to other research domains such as artificial intelligence. Okay, this is my last paragraph, and then this is kind of a cool one though. There are conceptual divisions in psychology in the so-called forces or waves based on its school and historical trends. Okay, so what that just means is we can talk about this, how psychology developed. First of all, it's not one straight line. A lot of people had different ideas, and we can talk about those different groups of ideas kind of as different waves of psychology or different forces within psychology, like the psychoanalytic, the behavioral, the cognitive, the positivist, the existential, the whole dark side of psychology when we get into things like manipulation, mind control, advertising, marketing, public relations. Not that those are all inherently dark, but that those are all manipulation based to greater or lesser extents. Public relations less so than mind control, but even think of what public relations is, right? It's massaging how the public relates to something that inherently has a manipulative element. Now, all manipulation isn't negative, right? Because you could say like you training your child is manipulating their behavior and their thoughts. That's not necessarily negative. It can be. Okay, again, sorry for that long rant. That's just the first sentence. This terminology is popularized among the psychologists to differentiate a growing humanism in therapeutic practices from the 1930s onwards, called the third force. Okay, and this is guys like your Rogers, Maslow, Alport, Eric Fromm, Rollo May. I don't know if I had Alport, but all those other people were on that list of 78 things or whatever. Hey, Evie, just one sec. Evie's just going hard on her. She's singing Frozen 2 big time. I don't know if the mic's catching that up. I'm going to try to finish this quick before I get interrupted. Um, these humanism concepts are also related to existential psychologists. You guys have heard me talk about people like Frankl, logotherapy, positive psychology like Martin Seligman. I recently did something about him. Collinger's approach to well-being and character development, we'll get to him, as well as transpersonal psychology. Transpersonal meaning like, well, that's getting into almost like a spiritualism aspect of it. Oh, I guess I could have just kept reading, incorporating such concepts as spirituality, self-transcendence, self-realization, self-actualization, mindfulness. In cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, similar terms have been incorporated, by which the first wave is considered initial behavioral therapy. So I would throw into that category your Skinners. A second wave with people like Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis, fascinating. He's on that list too. So he's rational emotive behavioral therapy. It's, if you're just Googling it, Ellis, his last name is Ellis. If you just put Ellis and then capitals REBT, you'll find stuff on him. Rational emotive behavioral therapy. We have to be rational with our emotions because they influence our behavior. That's core to his idea of therapy. And then a third wave with the acceptance and commitment therapy, which I'm not sure of. We'll have to read about that together. A fourth wave would be the one that incorporates transpersonal concepts and positive flourishing in a way criticized by some researchers for its heterogeneity and its theoretical direction dependent on a therapist's view. Yeah, exactly. I don't necessarily think some of the current trends are the highest I don't know what I mean by that, but I wouldn't assume that just the most recent stuff is the truest. A fifth wave has now been proposed by a group of researchers seeking to integrate earlier concepts into a unifying theory. Okay, interesting. So maybe we'll look at that wave model. So then that said at the end there, well, like now there's kind of this current push to be like, okay, well, yeah, we have some new creative ways of doing things, but let's not throw out all of the teachings of our founders. Okay, I hope that wasn't too bad. That was just my intro, and I got a bit ranty, but coming up next, early psychological thought. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and the audio was okay, and I wasn't scrolling too much. I'll try to keep that under control and be smooth. Okay, cheers.